Hello, this is Dr. John Wineland again, and today we're going to be talking about revivalism, sacramental meetings that were in Europe, and how this was transferred over to the frontier of America in what are known as camp meetings. This is quite important in the history of the Restoration movement because camp meetings are a big part of the sort of revivalism that is marked in the Restoration movement, especially in its beginnings in the 19th century. Well, I have created here for you a timeline, I guess you might say, a chart with dates on it, just to try to explain a bit about religion in America, religion in early America, and some of the key events. So this is just something that I made. It's not perfectly accurate, but I think it can illustrate what we need to get across then today. So for example, you see we have a graph here. This way we have years, obviously on the bottom, starting about 1600 and going up past 1900, approaching 2000. And on this side, it's religious enthusiasm, at least that's what I'm calling it. That is enthusiasm for attending church, devotion, that sort of thing. Sometimes it's hard to measure, but there are certain indicators that you can use. So, I think a lot of people think or imagine that religious excitement, enthusiasm, devotion was very high all the way across, and then, maybe it's kind of dropped off recently. That's really not the case, and that's what I'm trying to illustrate here. So I've got four events, four periods of time, a couple of events and a couple periods that I've indicated here with lines in different colors and letters. All right, so take a look at this. We have A, that's the First Great Awakening, 1734 to 1760. B, the Second Great Awakening, roughly 1800 to 1860. And then, of course, the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, and the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Okay? And so what this line shows us, basically, is that religious enthusiasm had dropped. In fact, it had gotten to a very low level here as we enter into the 18th century. And remember, the 18th century means the 1700s. The 19th century means the 1800s. The 20th century means the 1900s, and so on. So this had dropped. Why had it dropped? I have another date up here, the Age of Rationalism, from about 1650 to 1815. This is a period where people have become quite skeptical or cynical about religion and the Bible because they are sort of worshiping human minds and human knowledge. And so as that progresses, it begins in Europe, but of course that transfers here. Religious enthusiasm will plummet, will drop. Now, one of the things that we do see here in North America, and I think you also see it in England, is a series of revivals or revivalism that takes place. And certainly that's what happens here between 1734 and 1760. It begins really on university campus, like Princeton. It begins with certain evangelistic preaching or preachers, and it'll spark a great deal of religious enthusiasm over this roughly 30-year period, and so that's what's indicated by this upswing here. What ended it? Well, what sort of ended that upswing and the first Great Awakening was the coming of the war. That is the American Revolutionary War here. And then we see religious enthusiasm begins to decline. You might say, well, why? Why would a war do that? It occupies people's minds. People are worried about survival. They're worried about their loved ones being killed. They're worried about all the sort of political and military things that are going on, and it tends to distract them from religious, say, church attendance and spiritual things. Well, anyway, but then we begin to see around 1800 what's normally called the Second Great Awakening. And some people may not put it lasting as long as 1860. Maybe they'd say 1800 to 1845, 1850, somewhere in there. But what begins to make this end and decline is the coming of the U.S. Civil War, and then it declines from there. There are also other events after rationalism. We start to see kind of an attack on the Bible from within the church. That is, the education of the ministers and the clergy and the professors and the theologians quite skeptical of the Bible, but that's coming from within the church and what we might call modernism or liberalism. All right, so there's a little overview. You can take a look at that. Maybe that'll help you. Some people are visual learners, and if you're a visual learner, then this could help you. But this is the kind of overview we want to look at today. So let's take a look at the nature of revivals and revivalism. Okay? Nature of revivalism. Well, one of the things we see, as sort of illustrated here in this kind of I would call it not a political cartoon, but a sort of cartoon that will basically be attacking revivalism, because you can see the dollar sign up here with the cross with the S making it into a dollar sign, and you see the preacher here. Elmer Gantry would be somebody you'd want to look into if you want to see how this has been portrayed in American literature and cinema. And of course that hasn't stopped today. There are really, I can't think of any, I'm not saying there aren't any, but I can't think of any positive views of preachers, clergy, the church in modern films, even in not so modern films. Let's say over the last 60, 70 years, I can't really think of any. There may have been a couple out there that weren't produced, let's say, by Christian groups. Christian groups produce films that have positive message, but normally it has a very similar view of the minister and of what's going on. The minister is a charlatan, trying to get everybody's money. The minister is not practicing what he preaches. He's usually involved in some sort of sexual scandal or embezzling of money or abuse of drugs or alcohol or all the above. And so anyway, this is this is sort of a side thing from what we're talking about here today. But you'll be hard pressed to find positive examples of religious people, especially Christian religious people, especially conservative Christians and ministers and so forth, in television, movie, that sort of thing, because it's usually portrayed the same way. Now, I'm not saying that people don't abuse their power. There's been plenty who have. But I'm just saying it's a very one-sided view. Well, the nature of revivalism then, and this is why it gets kind of a bad name even within the church, is that it's filled with emotion. And remember, I told you earlier that there's been this kind of pendulum swinging in the history of the church from uh, intellect to emotion, intellect to emotion, and the head and the heart. And so definitely revivalism is over on the heart side, right? The emotional side. And they would look at the church, many of the church, and they'd say, well, this is just too formal, it's too rigid, it's too cold, it doesn't appeal to my heart, it doesn't appeal to my emotions. And so from time to time, movements of far more emotional nature come about. And that's the nature of revivalism. It's filled with emotions. And we're going to see that because of the events that take place, a lot of people are going to be talking about religion. Certainly we see this in the Second Great Awakening, because remember, these people did not have much entertainment. Unlike what you have today, you have your cell phone, which you're probably glued to most of the time, with all kinds of tickety-tocks and face-ity books, and what do they call Twitter now? X, and you've got so many apps that you can use, right? Instagram and so forth. You've got YouTube with streams, all kinds of videos and movies and clips. You have an abundance of stuff just on your phone, certainly on a laptop, or if you still, like me, are antiquated and have an actual television with a streaming device on it, then you have all sorts of other things like Netflix, and you can get that on your phone too, Netflix and YouTube TV and Hulu, and on it goes. So you have a wealth of things to entertain you or distract you. Plus, I'm not even mentioning, I guess I am now, video games, right? All kinds of chat sorts of things as well. Well, anyway, we won't go through all of that. But what my point is you have a wealth of things to entertain you. These people did not. There was no radio, television, recordings, internet of any kind. They were out in the wilderness. There weren't that many people around. They lived a very tough life, and a life filled with work, where they were trying to survive. Farming, many of them, raising animals, trying to raise their family, trying to feed their family. And so something like a revival coming to their area was very attractive for them to go, just to have something to see, something to do. And they heard there was a lot of stuff going on there, sometimes strange things going on. And so discussion of religion becomes, I think, more common maybe than it is today. Our society's growing is growing to be much more secular. Anyway, the other thing that would happen at these revivals or camp meetings is preaching. There would be many people preaching, but they would just get up and preach. They would get up and preach as they said the Spirit moved them. And so these people, many of them, had no training. They had no training in interpreting or understanding the Bible. They were reading it. They were moved to say something, and they said it. And you have to remember at this time, denominations like, say, Presbyterians, Methodists, and others had a very, I would say, elaborate, certainly strict policy about who could preach and who could be ordained. You had to be licensed to preach. You probably haven't heard much about that, but that's what they had to do. They had to have a license to preach. Not just anybody could get up and preach. You had to be, in some cases, of course, ordained would license you to preach, but there could be people that weren't yet ordained who could be licensed to preach, but they would go through a series of testing. They would go through a series of sort of examination before they'd be allowed to preach. But here at these revivals, it was anything goes. Anybody who wanted to preach basically just stand up and preach. They would get up on a stump. They'd get up on the back of a wagon. They would gather people around. They'd start to speak, and, people would stop and see what they say. And if they were entertaining or whatever, well, then so much the better. They would stay because there might be multiple people preaching at the same time at one of these camp meetings. So what we see is, you might say, well, they had a lot of enthusiasm. Yes. They had a lot of emotion. Yes. I think they probably had good intentions, but we might say they had more zeal than knowledge. I think that would be fair to say. So this is the situation. Well, the camp meeting movement will actually begin in Kentucky, here in North America, and it begins here in Logan County, Kentucky. Logan County, Kentucky. This begins and can be traced back to a guy named James McGready, and we'll talk more about him later in a different discussion when we talk about Barton W. Stone. But he was a Presbyterian minister, but he was very much what we might call a New Light, not an Old Light, but a New Light way of thinking. Remember, New Light means that you are pro-revival, pro-camp meeting kind of things. Old Lights would say, no, this is too kind of crazy, wild. We're very suspicious of it. We need to shut it down because it's going to lead to trouble. Well, James McGready will begin this sort of camp meeting ideas beginning in the late 1790s. This Presbyterian minister will move to Kentucky, to Logan County, as you see down there on the state line with Tennessee today. And he decides to hold what will come to be known as the very first camp meeting at the Gasper River Church in Logan County, Kentucky. Okay, so this is where it all begins. It begins in July of 1800. July of 1800. The news went out. How did the news go out? Remember, they don't have any way of announcing it other than word of mouth. Maybe a advertisement in a newspaper or a journal. Maybe flyers that were posted. Maybe letters were sent to different congregations telling them, come down here to the Gasper River meeting. It's going to be an amazing event, and so on and so forth. Well, in July of 1800, 8,000 people show up for this Gasper River meeting, the very first camp meeting. They stayed for days. Now remember, they had to travel long distances. They're traveling either by walking or riding some kind of horse or mule or something, or hitched up to a wagon. And some had to travel 100 miles or more, which if you're doing that that way, it's going to take you quite a while to get there, right? If you're walking, are you going to walk 20 miles in a day? That's quite a bit to walk 20 miles in a day. If you're taking a horse, even that would be pushing it, but I guess you could do it maybe in, say, 3-4 days you could get there. And then, of course, 3 or 4 days to get home. And then you're there, say, 4 or 5 days. So, I mean, you're going to be gone now for 10 days, maybe to 2 weeks. So there was no place, remember, there are no fast foods, there are no motels, there are no restaurants. So you had to bring your food with you. You had to bring, maybe bring a cow with you so you can milk the cow, because cows have to be milked. And you bring a chicken with you, maybe get some eggs. You bring some flour. Maybe you bring some fat back, some pork or bacon or something. And then you would have to cook. You'd have to cook your own meals and eat. And where would you sleep? Maybe in a tent. Maybe under your wagon, maybe on top of your wagon. You're going to have to improvise. It's going to basically be camping and cooking your own food. They camped around the church grounds, and then they had preaching in this meeting. Well, this is interesting now, and we're going to see that this finds its roots. Why was a Presbyterian doing this? We might ask ourselves, why a Presbyterian? Well, we can trace this back to Scotland, because that's where Presbyterians start, if you remember. Presbyterians get their start as the Church of Scotland, and we talk about that in another video. But it starts there, and one of the things that the Presbyterians in Scotland would do is they would have what they called sacramental celebrations. And this would be where people would return to their home congregation, and they would come there on a set date, kind of like a homecoming sort of thing, and they would come and they would celebrate communion all together with their family, and hundreds of people could show up at once to these things. So this is what most people would believe is the origin of camp meetings in Scotland. Now, in the Presbyterian Church, in the Christian churches, if you're a member of a Christian church, then you're taking your communion every week. And I don't know if you know this or not, but that's pretty unusual for Protestants to take communion every week. But for these Presbyterians, they were only doing it twice a year. Some churches, some groups only do it 4 times a year, quarterly. But at any rate, so this is a special occasion. You're going to have Lord's Supper, communion, which you only did twice a year, and you're going to go back to your home area. You're going to see all of your relatives. You're going to see all your friends, and you'll stay. It'll take you a while to get there, and then you'll stay, and you'll have the service, and then you will head back home. Well, people travel long distance. Often they would arrive on Thursday or Friday. There would be preaching and so forth. And then on Sunday, they would have this communion service. And then, Monday, Tuesday, they would head back home. Well, there is one at Cambusland in 1742 that's recorded, one of these sacramental celebrations, where 30,000 people showed up and attended this sacramental celebration. Now, you can go back and check the population of Scotland in 1742. That's a huge amount of people. And I think it's pretty clear that when the Scots, the Presbyterians, and those associated with the Presbyterian Church brought this idea of a sacramental celebration, and that is probably where the camp meeting gets started. All right, so what is the nature of these camp meetings? Here we see a tree, and what is that? That's a full moon. That's going to be an indicator, because notices were sent out in advance. You'd have to plan this. Somebody would have to plan the meeting, right? So let's say you decide you want to do this. You would try to figure out the best time to do it. Now, you have to remember, people are going to have to travel quite a ways, and the weather's a big thing that's important. So that's why these would normally happen in the summertime. For several reasons. They'd happen in the summertime because the weather was good. And it would also happen in the summer times because your crops were in the field growing, and you could afford to leave them for 4 or 5 days or even a week, and they would do okay, right? Because somebody's going to have to take care of your crops and your animals, so you're going to have to really plan this. And also, they would check and see when was there going to be a full moon. So this is typically when they'd want to do it, because remember, there are no battery-operated flashlights. There are no outdoor lights. There's only campfires, maybe torches. And of course, if you have a full moon, that would be the best time. A full moon in the summer, let's say July, August, when the days, there's a lot of sunlight and you can hit a full moon. So that is the time when you want to do this. So you're going to see a lot of these are going to happen in July and August. Occasionally maybe in a June situation, but that's when they're going to happen. And here's the thing, why do people show up to these things? Why? I already kind of alluded to this earlier. Well, people did have religious concerns. They were out on the frontier. They were away from their way of life that they had back further east. They were kind of isolated. And they did have religious concerns. They were perhaps worried religiously about their salvation and so forth. So that's one thing, is they just have religious concern, and I guess we might hope that would be the main thing or the most things, but there were others. Some were just curious. If you're living out in the frontier of, let's say, Kentucky, western Kentucky, there's not much going on. And you hear there's going to be this big meeting, there's going to be hundreds, maybe thousands of people. You may never have seen that many people together in one place. And you hear they're going to do preaching and stuff, but you also hear sometimes there's some kind of different things going on. You just want to go check it out. You're curious. And some might come just for entertainment, just like you might go, like I know most of you probably go to the Burning Man Festival, right? I'm sure you were there this past summer and you got washed out in the rain, so I hope you're okay. But, they go for the entertainment. There's going to be preaching. There's going to be strange things happening. You're going to meet a lot of people. You'll be able to socialize. You'll be able to meet people you've never seen before and maybe never see again. If you're looking for a wife or a husband, might be a good place to go. How about if you're a politician? You're running to be governor of Kentucky or some kind of state senator or something or whatever. You could show up at these things and you could shake hundreds, maybe thousands of hands, get your name out there, and perhaps get yourself elected. So there's a lot of reasons to show up. These things would last several days, maybe even a week, and typically it would begin to end when the food starts to run out or when the weather changes and it starts to get really rainy and wet and kind of uncomfortable to be there. So that's why people come. A variety of reasons, religious concern, curiosity, entertainment, so forth. What kind of people attend? Well, you're going to find that while this was put on, say the first camp meeting by a Presbyterian, and we're going to talk about Barton W. Stone, who was a Presbyterian, who does the largest camp meeting. I think everyone would agree. He was a Presbyterian. But was it just for Presbyterians? No. It was for all groups. Everybody was welcome to come. And this was also unusual. Typically, different groups stayed to themselves. Methodists with Methodists, Presbyterians with Presbyterians, Baptists with Baptists, and so forth. So here is an artist's rendering of the Cane Ridge Revival. We're going to talk more about that. August 7 through 12, 1801. Barton W. Stone goes to that first meeting, the Gasper River camp meeting, and he gets inspired. He decides, I want to do this back where I'm preaching at Cane Ridge, and we'll talk more about that later. And so look at all these people out here, just thousands of them, okay? And there's Barton W. Stone standing on his stump and preaching to people. Okay. Well, the most common groups that show up, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians. There's a lot of preaching. And if you looked around this camp meeting here, you would find, who knows, 8, 10 people preaching at one time. Because remember, they don't have a sound system. And if you've got hundreds, you got thousands of people and you're outdoors, it's going to be hard for your voice to be heard. So you're probably going to try to get up high on the back of a wagon, a stump, or something like that, so that people can see you and hear you. So there were several sermons going on simultaneously. Now, for example, especially we know at the Cane Ridge camp meeting, we're going to have what are called religious exercises. This little guy's supposed to be jumping, but he's not. And we'll come back to that. I posted a video for you about the squirrel revival, and you'll have to watch that. That's just for fun. But here's a squirrel jumping. And look at these people dancing here, Well, strange things happen. Strange things are recorded happening, certainly at the Cane Ridge camp meeting, Cane Ridge meeting. People fall on the ground. They just fall over like they've passed out. And then people have to revive them. Some people just start running back and forth all around, sometimes even running into trees and things. People begin jerking and moving and jerking. And some begin to bark like, that kind of thing. Or laughing, sort of uncontrollably laughing, or just sort of singing, have a singing sound, but it's not really any song you've ever heard. They're dancing, they're swaying, and all of this is going on while you got multiple people preaching. Well, you got thousands of people all over the place. So you can see this would be, in some people's minds, complete confusion, complete disorder, and not something that seems very religious or very orderly, as we read in the Old Testament, "Be still and know that I am God." Well, these strange things will happen. So as a result then, we see the results, and we'll talk more about these camp meetings later, but we're going to see the results of the Second Great Awakening is that unbelief begins to decline, church membership begins to increase, and with that then, there's going to be new churches that are starting, new congregations that will start. And as those new churches start, guess what? They're going to need ministers, but we don't have enough ministers. And so this will then lead to new colleges starting up to train ministers to go out to these new congregations which have come about because of the Second Great Awakening. So what I have for you here then is a chart. Let me get myself out of the way. I'll make myself invisible here for a moment. The growth of congregations from 1700 to 1860. Just take a look. Here's different groups. 1700 Baptists, 33 congregations in America. 28 Presbyterians. Look at the Congregationalists, 146. There were no Methodists, and there's certainly no Christian Church, Church of Christ. 80 years later, look at how the Baptists have grown. 455. Presbyterians, 490. Everybody's up. Congregationalists up to 745. But then when we get to the Second Great Awakening, take a look at this. 1820 Baptists, over 2,700 congregations. Same for the Methodists. 1,700 Presbyterians, 1,100 Congregationalist churches, and we see the emergence of 20 Christian Churches of Christ. And by the Civil War then, at the sort of end of the Second Great Awakening, take a look at these numbers. Almost 20,000 Methodist churches, over 2,000 Christian Churches of Christ, over 2,000 Congregationalists, over 12,000 Baptists, over 6,000 Presbyterians. So you see the growth of congregations here at this time. Well, here's our last screen for this lecture, this presentation. Church membership as a percentage of total population, just to give you the idea. In 1700, only 10% of people were members of the church. By 1790, it had dropped to only 5%. By 1850, during this, the midst of this Second Great Awakening, it had gone up dramatically to 16%. And by the way, then, church membership continues to grow in the United States, peaking out in the late 1960s, about 64, 65%, and it's been dropping ever since. Okay, there's a lot of reasons why we might bring that up. One of them is, of course, secularism is coming in, liberalism, modernism. In the 1960s, they had a whole movement that said God is dead, God had been invented by people, and we don't need to believe in God anymore. This was some of the things that were being said. So these are all things that we're going to be talking about, but I wanted to introduce them here to you, and this will, I think, give you a good background to help us understand what's going on with the Restoration movement, as we'll continue that on later. Have a great day.